There's a tree in South America that can kill you if you stand beneath it in the rain. The sap blisters skin on contact. Burning the wood releases toxic smoke that can cause blindness. For centuries, indigenous peoples used it to poison arrow tips. And in the 20th century, we planted millions of them. Not by accident, by design. The question isn't why we did it. The question is why we kept doing it long after we understood what it would cost. This is a story about the Manchineel tree, Hippomane mancinella, and about Florida. But it's also a story about something larger, about the way systems absorb bad decisions, normalize them, and make them permanent. About how solutions become problems so slowly that, by the time anyone notices, reversal is no longer an option. We're going to move through this carefully, because what happened with this tree didn't happen all at once, and it didn't happen because anyone set out to cause harm. It happened the way most environmental and economic mistakes happen, through small choices that made sense in isolation, through incentives that pointed in one direction, while consequences accumulated in another, and through the basic human tendency to treat warnings as suggestions. The Manchineel arrived in Florida's cultivated landscapes in the early 20th century. Not the native stands that had always existed in coastal areas, but as an ornamental, a curiosity, something exotic to plant in yards and parks. By mid-century, it had become something else entirely. And by the time doctors started seeing the pattern in emergency rooms, the tree had already become infrastructure. Before we talk about what went wrong, we need to understand what the Manchineel was supposed to be. In its native range, coastal areas from Florida through the Caribbean and down into Central and South America, the Manchineel occupied a specific ecological role. It grew in the harshest conditions, sandy, salt-sprayed coastal zones where few other trees could survive. Its dense root system stabilized shorelines. Its canopy provided shade in environments where shade was scarce. For the ecosystems that evolved alongside it, the Manchineel wasn't a problem. It was infrastructure. The toxicity wasn't a design flaw. It was a feature. The milky sap contains phorbol, a compound that causes severe contact dermatitis, blistering, and temporary blindness if it reaches the eyes. Indigenous peoples throughout the Caribbean understood this. They marked the trees. They taught children not to touch them. They used the toxin strategically, carefully, with full knowledge of what it could do. The danger was acknowledged, mapped, integrated into cultural knowledge. When Spanish colonizers arrived, they called it Manzanilla de la Muerte, Little Apple of Death. The fruit, which resembles a small green apple, is sweet-smelling and toxic. There are documented cases of sailors and explorers dying after eating it. The tree gained a reputation. It appeared on maps. It showed up in journals and cautionary tales. But that was the wild Manchineel, the native stands. The trees that grew where they had always grown, in places where people knew to avoid them. The cultivated Manchineel was different. By the early 1900s, Florida was in the middle of a transformation. Land was being drained, developed, subdivided. The state was selling itself as a tropical paradise, and that meant importing the visual language of the tropics. Bougainvillea, palm trees, exotic shrubs, anything that looked lush and foreign. The Manchineel, with its dense glossy leaves and gnarled trunk, fit the aesthetic perfectly. Nurseries began propagating it. Landscapers began planting it. And because it was native to Florida's coasts, it wasn't treated as an invasive species. It was treated as a rediscovery, a way to bring the authentic Florida landscape into planned communities and resort developments. The fact that it was toxic was noted, certainly, but the assumption was that people would simply know to avoid it, that warning signs would be sufficient, that a tree this dangerous would regulate itself through common sense. That assumption held for a while. Through the 1920s and 30s, the Manchineel remained a relatively uncommon ornamental, a novelty, something planted in botanical gardens and a few ambitious estates. The danger was abstract, theoretical, the kind of thing mentioned in garden club newsletters but rarely encountered. Then came the development boom, and with it, a new kind of efficiency. The shift happened after World War II. Florida's population exploded. Entire cities were planned and built within a decade. And in that kind of rapid development, decisions about landscaping aren't made tree by tree. They're made in bulk. Developers purchase plants by the thousands. Landscaping plans are standardized, replicated across dozens of subdivisions. What gets chosen isn't necessarily what's safest or most appropriate. It's what's available, affordable, and fast-growing. The Manchineel checked all those boxes. It grew quickly in poor soil. It tolerated salt spray, which made it ideal for coastal developments. It required almost no maintenance. And because it was technically native, it appealed to the emerging environmental consciousness of the 1960s and 70s, the idea that native plants were inherently better, more sustainable, more in harmony with the land. No one made a single decision to plant Manchineel trees across South Florida. Instead, 1,000 small decisions pointed in the same direction. A county parks department specified it for a beachfront project because it was the cheapest option that met environmental guidelines. A landscaping company used it in a subdivision because it was already growing in their nursery. A golf course designer included it for visual texture along a water hazard. Each decision made sense in context. Each decision was defensible, and because the tree's toxicity was well documented, there were warning signs. After all, it was assumed that liability had been addressed. But those warning signs were written in English. They were small, often faded, sometimes missing entirely. And they assumed a level of familiarity with local flora that most residents, especially transplants from other states, simply didn't have. To someone who had just moved to Florida from Ohio, the Manchineel looked like any other tropical tree. The warning sign, if they noticed it at all, seemed like a formality. Like those warnings on hairdryers not to use them in the bathtub, technically necessary, but not something anyone actually needed to worry about. The other assumption was that people would stay away, that nobody would picnic under the tree, let children climb it, or seek shelter beneath it during a rainstorm. But that assumption failed to account for human behavior, for the fact that a shady tree near a beach is an irresistible attraction, for the fact that tourists don't read warning signs, for the fact that children explore. By 1985, emergency room visits related to Manchineel exposure had become common enough that Miami area hospitals started tracking them separately. The injuries followed a pattern. Families would spend a day at the beach. It would start to rain. They'd run for cover under the nearest tree, often a Manchineel. The rain would wash the sap from the leaves onto their skin. Within minutes, the burning would start. By the time they reached a hospital, their skin would be blistered, their eyes swollen shut if any sap had splashed their faces. Children would climb the trees, get sap on their hands, then rub their eyes. Landscaping crews, often recent immigrants unfamiliar with local flora, would trim the trees without protective equipment. Homeless individuals seeking shelter would camp beneath them overnight. The medical response was straightforward. Rinse with water, treat the burns, prescribe antihistamines for the allergic reaction. But the injuries themselves were often severe. Second-degree burns weren't uncommon. Some victims experienced temporary blindness that lasted days. There were cases of people going into anaphylactic shock. Public health officials began to take notice. In 1987, a county supervisor in Collier County proposed removing all Manchineel trees from public parks. The motion failed. The reasoning was liability-based. If the county officially acknowledged the trees as dangerous and removed them from some areas, they could be held responsible for not removing them from all areas. Better to leave them in place and maintain the warning signs. Similar discussions played out in municipalities across South Florida, and each time the conclusion was the same. Removal was too expensive. The trees were technically native. They had been planted legally. And as long as warnings were posted, the responsibility fell on individuals to heed them. What nobody wanted to say out loud was that the system had already absorbed the Manchineel. It had been written into landscaping codes, environmental assessments, and maintenance budgets. Removing it would require admitting that a mistake had been made, not by one person or one agency, but by the entire apparatus of development that had shaped South Florida for 50 years. So the trees stayed, and the injuries continued. But the human cost, as it turned out, wasn't the only thing accumulating. Maria Delgado worked as a housekeeper at a beachfront hotel in Key Largo. Part of her job involved sweeping the pool deck each morning before guests arrived. One morning in 1993, she swept beneath a Manchineel tree just after a light rain. The sap was still wet on the leaves. Droplets transferred to her skin. By the time her shift ended, her arms were covered in blisters. She went to the emergency room, received treatment, and missed 3 days of work. She wasn't compensated. The hotel's position was that she should have known about the tree. That warning signs were posted, that she had been employed there long enough to recognize local hazards. Maria's story isn't unique. It's one of hundreds. Most of them don't involve lawsuits or newspaper articles. They involve people who encountered the tree once, suffered, recovered, and moved on. But the pattern matters. Because what becomes clear when you aggregate these incidents is that the burden of the Manchineel wasn't distributed evenly. Tourists staying in expensive resorts rarely encountered it. Those properties had the resources to remove the trees or replace them with safer alternatives. But public beaches, county parks, and budget hotels kept them. Landscaping crews, maintenance workers, and people who lived or worked near the trees bore the majority of the risk. It became a kind of environmental inequality. The tree's toxicity was predictable, documented, preventable, but prevention required resources, and those resources were allocated according to a logic that prioritized aesthetics and cost efficiency over safety. And as the injuries accumulated, something else was happening that almost nobody noticed. By the late 1990s, the Manchineel had become self-sustaining. The trees planted in the 1950s and 60s were now mature. They were producing fruit. Birds and small mammals, which could consume the fruit without harm, were spreading the seeds. New Manchineel trees were appearing in areas where they hadn't been planted along roadsides, in empty lots, in the margins of nature preserves. The tree had escaped cultivation. It had become feral infrastructure. Ecologists began noticing changes in coastal plant communities. The Manchineel, unburdened by the pests and diseases that kept it in check in other parts of its range, was outcompeting native vegetation in some areas. Its dense shade prevented other species from establishing. Its toxicity deterred herbivores, giving it an advantage over plants that had evolved in balance with local wildlife. In some respects, this was the tree doing what it had always done. But it was doing it in quantities and densities that weren't natural. The cultivated Manchineel had created conditions for an ecological shift, and now that shift was self-reinforcing. Attempts at removal began in the early 2000s, but the process was expensive, dangerous, and incomplete. Cutting down a Manchineel tree releases toxic sap and requires specialized equipment. The wood can't be burned, the smoke is poisonous. It has to be handled, transported, and disposed of carefully. And even after a tree is removed, the root system often survives and sends up new shoots. Some municipalities succeeded in clearing the trees from high-traffic areas, but others lacked the budget. And in many cases, the trees were now on private property, tangled in questions of ownership and liability. A homeowner couldn't be forced to remove a tree that had been planted before they bought the property, especially if it was technically native. By 2005, environmental scientists were describing this situation as locked in. The Manchineel was now part of South Florida's landscape. Not because it belonged there exactly, but because the systems that might have prevented its spread had failed to act when action was still possible. And then, in 2017, something unexpected emerged in the medical literature. Studying traditional medicine in the Caribbean had been investigating the manchineel's chemical properties. The same phorbol compounds that caused burns and blisters also showed potential as a treatment for certain types of cancer. This wasn't irony, it was ecology. Plants don't evolve toxins to be malicious. They evolve them as chemical defenses, and those same chemicals often have pharmacological properties. Digitalis, used to treat heart conditions, comes from foxglove, a poisonous plant. Aspirin is derived from willow bark. The Manchineel was simply following the same pattern. But the revelation didn't change the situation in Florida. The trees were still dangerous, the injuries were still happening, and the idea that the Manchineel might someday contribute to cancer treatment didn't address the fact that it was currently sending people to emergency rooms on a regular basis. What it did do was complicate the narrative. The story could no longer be told as simple mistake, bad tree, bad decision, obvious solution. It became a story about trade-offs, unintended consequences, and the difficulty of unwinding decisions once they've been absorbed into infrastructure. The Manchineel wasn't just a landscaping error, it was a case study in how systems handle risk, how they distribute it, how they decide whose safety matters and whose doesn't, and how, once a choice has been made, the momentum of that choice becomes almost impossible to reverse. The tree had also reshaped the landscape in ways that extended beyond Florida. The Manchineel's success as an ornamental had led to its introduction in other tropical and subtropical regions: Hawaii, Australia, parts of India. In some of these places, it had become invasive. In others, it remained a controlled ornamental, but everywhere it was, planted, the same pattern repeated: initial enthusiasm, gradual recognition of the danger, half-hearted attempts at management, eventual resignation. The Florida experience became a reference point, a warning that was mostly ignored, because by then a larger question had already taken shape. There's a term in systems theory, lock-in. It describes what happens when a choice, once made, becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. Not because the choice was right, but because everything that came after was built around it. The infrastructure, the institutions, the assumptions, all of it reinforces the original decision until changing it would require changing everything. The Manchineel is locked in, not everywhere, but in enough places that its presence has become normalized. The warning signs are still there. The injuries still happen. The cost is accepted because the alternative comprehensive removal, ecological restoration, systemic reassessment would require an admission that nobody wants to make. And that's the real story. Not that someone planted a poisonous tree, but that once it was planted, the systems designed to protect people proved incapable of removing it. The economic incentives pointed toward leaving it in place. The legal frameworks made removal complicated. The bureaucracies couldn't coordinate. And so, the tree remained, and the burden of avoiding it fell on individuals. This pattern appears everywhere, in infrastructure, in policy, in technology. A decision is made that seems reasonable at the time. It gets built into systems, it scales, and by the time the consequences become clear, reversal is no longer a simple matter of recognizing a mistake. It's a matter of undoing 50 years of compounding choices. The Manchineel isn't a villain. It's a tree doing what trees do. The failure isn't botanical. It's institutional. It's the failure of systems to adapt when new information emerges, to prioritize long-term safety over short-term convenience, to recognize when a solution has become a problem. There's still a Manchineel tree growing on a beach in the Florida Keys. It has a sign posted on it, weathered and faded, that reads, "Danger, poisonous tree, do not touch." On a busy afternoon, dozens of people walk past it. Some notice the sign, Some don't. Children play nearby. Tourists take photos beneath it, unaware of what they're standing under. The tree is still there because removing it would be expensive, complicated, and unlikely to prevent the next person from encountering a different Manchineel somewhere else. It's still there because the system decided, a long time ago, that the danger was manageable. And it's still there because once something becomes infrastructure, it stops being a choice.